Good morning. My name is Katie Merrill. I'm a member and board member of the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. And if you're like me, you're glad to be inside on this really hot, humid morning. I want to start, we usually start with a reading or a quote or some thoughts about humanism. And this morning I wanted to do something that I've been seeing more and more at public talks and things that I've been attending, which is a land acknowledgement to acknowledge where we are and where the history of this place. As recorded by the late 17th century, there were many Potawatomi settlements in this area. But as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Potawatomi were removed first to Iowa and then to Kansas. Over 150 people died during this trail of death. More than half of them were children, and others fled to Canada. There are currently several bans in the US and Canada. Some would still retain the language. Traditional Potawatomi religion is part of every aspect of tribal life. It connects people to their community, to nature, to their ancestors, and to their descendants. And for me, when I read that, I wanted to reflect a little bit on humanism and what it means to me on an everyday basis, which is the famous Felix Adler quote of, "Act so as to elicit the best in others and thereby in thyself." And I think the notion is if we all do our best job every day, we do make the world a better place, and we connect, we do service to our ancestors, and we do the best we can for our descendants. So with that, I want to welcome you to today's talk, which is from Ben Ost called The American Dream. Is the American Dream Dead? Ben is an associate professor of economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago with expertise in labor economics and education policy. His academic research explores the consequences of layoffs, determinants of student success, and interactions between college and the labor market. I also want to note that I took a peek at his Rate My Professor scores, and students think he's a really good professor. And the one grumpy guy just thought it was surprising he was supposed to go to class. So I think that's more on him than on Ben. And he's also the father of a couple of kids in our Sunday school, and his wife is also active in our society, and we're grateful to have his family. Before I invite Ben to step up, I want to remind you that you can, there will be an interlude after his talk, and you can put your questions in the YouTube chat. And they will get passed along to me, and I will ask them of Ben and during the Q&A afterwards. So with that, I want to welcome Ben Ost and talk about the American Dream and whether or not it's dead. Thanks, Ben.
All right, thank you, Katie, so much. That was great, and it's amazing to be here in person. I did a talk last summer over Zoom, and it's just not the same. So I'm going to be talking about the American Dream and whether it has died. And there's a lot of different definitions of the American Dream that people have used. I'm going to be focusing on economic mobility. And so I think a quote that encapsulates this idea of the American Dream pretty well is actually from Karl Marx. I think, nope. I'm not getting the next slide. All right. All right, well, I can give the basic idea of the quote. So should it work now?
Oh, now you want to.
Oh, there we go. All right, so this quote is from Karl Marx speaking in the mid-19th century, and he was describing the US as distinct from other countries, especially other European countries, or I guess from European countries. And he says, the position of wage laborers is for a very large part of the American people, but a probational state which they are sure to leave. And so this just reflects the idea that in America, unlike, say, the old world, there was more meritocracy, or at least a perception of meritocracy. There wasn't the same aristocratic traditions where there's nobility titles and things along those lines. And so in America, unlike the old world, where you start off doesn't necessarily determine where you end up. And so this idea of the American dream has attracted immigrants in the 19th century and the 20th century and today still, that you move here with maybe not very much, but you can work your way up and you can rise to the very top economically and also socially. Okay, so this talk is going to be mainly about evaluating this idea, both historically, but in particular today, and comparing the US in terms of mobility, economic mobility, to other countries. Okay, so before I get into that, this first slide shows, let me just pull it up on my screen. All right, so this first slide shows what people believe about American mobility. So it's not actual mobility levels, it's just surveying people in 27 different countries, and it's asking people, do you agree with these different statements? And so the first statement here is, do people get rewarded for their effort? The US here is indicated in that red triangle. And so you see that the US, 61% of people in the year 2000 when this survey took place agreed with this idea that people in the US get rewarded for their effort. That varies tremendously by country. And so in the US it's 60%, in France it's only 23% in the same year. And so there's certainly a perception that America is unique in terms of its ability to reward people for effort. I shouldn't say unique. I think the Philippines is at the very top there. So there's another country above the US in terms of perceptions of rewarding effort, but it's certainly an outlier compared to similar sorts of countries. This slide shows the same set of 27 countries, but it's for a bunch of different questions. So the top question is the same one we just looked at, people get rewarded for their effort. The next question that people were asked to agree or disagree with in different countries was, people get rewarded for their intelligence and their skills. And in this question, the US is a total outlier. 70% agree with that statement, that in the US, people get rewarded for their intelligence and skills, whereas some countries, only 10% of the population agrees with that. So the perception of mobility is very different. Another way of seeing that is the next question, coming from a wealthy family is essential or very important to getting ahead. And so unlike the first two questions, the US is an outlier, but in the other direction. So people think it's not particularly important. Only 20% would agree with the sentiment that you have to come from a wealthy family in order to be successful. Whereas in some other countries, that number is 60%. The last two questions aren't really about mobility, but I put them up here because I think they're related to sort of values. So the fourth from the top question here is, differences in income differences in income in our country are too large. So this is asking, is the gap between the poor and the rich too big? Most people throughout the world agree that yes, it's too big, but the US not quite as much as other countries. So in the US, it's something like 60% think that the gap is too large, whereas there's some countries where that number is more like 90% or almost 100% of people believe that the gap is too large. And then the last question is, what should be done about it? And so who agrees that it's the responsibility of the government to reduce differences in income? In the US, it's only something like 35%. It's an outlier of all these 27 countries. Some countries, almost everybody, 90% agree that it's the government's responsibility to try to reduce inequality. All right, so I would say in terms of perceptions currently, the American dream is still very much alive. People perceive in America that there's an ability to move up if you put in effort and you have the skills, and that coming from a very wealthy family is not particularly important here. Okay, so when I'm measuring economic mobility, there's a lot of different ways of measuring economic mobility. I'll describe a couple, but I think broadly it's the ability to advance beyond the status of your parents. And what does advance mean? It can be a lot of different things. So for income, you might ask, when your parents were 40, they had a certain amount of income. When you become 40 yourself, do you have more or less than they did at that same age? And that would be adjusted for inflation to sort of think about the real value of the income. You could also think about education level mobility. Do people with parents without much education, are they able to get education themselves? Or do they also end up with low education? Occupational mobility, home ownership. I'm going to be focused mainly on income, partly because it's easy to measure, and it's also a good sort of overall summary of the economic resources available to the family. Okay. So when thinking about mobility, there's two very different types of mobility that one can think about, and I'll describe both of them separately. And they're related, but they could go in opposite directions. And so the first is absolute mobility. This is asking whether, as an adult, does a child earn more than her parents did at the same age? And so absolute mobility is important if you want to know whether children are doing better over subsequent generations, whether the society as a whole is doing better. You could have a society, say like China right now, that's growing very rapidly, and each subsequent generation is sort of doing better than the generation that came before. And so they have a lot of absolute mobility. The whole society is moving up. Separate from that is this idea of relative mobility, which also matters, which is not so much do people do better than their parents, but do people stay where they are in terms of their relative ranking in the society? So do children from the poorest families end up being the poorest adults? And you can imagine that in China, say, that's growing very rapidly, you could have a lot of growth where everyone's doing better than their parents, but still the poorest parents have the poorest children. The poorest children maybe are doing better than their parents did, but they're still sort of in terms of relative position, they're in the exact same place. And so I'll talk about both of these. I'm going to first talk about absolute mobility. In a lot of ways, that's more important. And then I'll talk about relative mobility. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to measure absolute mobility. I think the most intuitive one is to just ask the question, do people earn more than their parents did at the same age? And so the y-axis here is the share of children making more than their parents. And this is adjusted for inflation. And again, the children are adult children. They're not like the share of kids making more than their parents when they're 5. It's when they become 40 years old, do they make more than their parents did at that same age? And we have a bunch of different cohorts here, people born in different years. Excuse me. And so it ranges from the 1940s up until 1984. That's the most recent birth cohort you can study because those are the kids that are able to, who are old enough at this point to actually have earnings. 1984 is actually when I was born, so I'm the very, very last dot on this. And that's unfortunate because this is what it looks like. In the 40s, you have quite a bit of absolute mobility. And so 9 out of 10 of those born in the 40s, so like early baby boomers, could expect to earn more than their parents earned. That's just fallen precipitously over time. And so now my generation, millennials, only 1 in 2 earn more than their parents. And so it's basically a coin flip at this point, whether you're going to do better in absolute terms than your parents did. Okay. So kids are less likely to surpass their parents than they have really at any point in US history. Why is this? It primarily reflects stagnant wages for families that are earning below the median. So in the past 40 years, the big story with wages is that wage growth has been more or less okay overall on average, but it's been very unevenly felt. And so the sort of richest people in society have seen extraordinary amounts of wage growth. People at the median or about the average have seen very little wage growth, and people at the bottom have seen very little wage growth. So this graph illustrates that. So this graph, there we go. In orange, we have the 90th percentile. So these are people who are relatively affluent. And so in 1965, the 90th percentile was making about 100,000. By 2016, it was nearer to 200,000. So quite a bit of wage growth for people earning at the top. For the median in dark blue and for the 10th percentile in light blue, so these are people at average or the bottom of the distribution, there's really nothing going on. No real changes. There is a little bit of growth, but it's nowhere near as what you see in the top. And so you can imagine if you have a portion of the population where there's no wage growth, where sort of all the families are doing about as well as the families were doing before, then it's not surprising that about half of the kids end up doing it like their parents did, and half of the kids do worse. If you focus just on a society where wage growth is robust for everybody, then you expect most kids to be doing better than their parents. But that's not what we've seen in the US. Okay. All right, so let me just look at what slide I'm on. Okay. So measuring absolute mobility is pretty simple. You're just asking this question, do people make more than their parents? Measuring relative mobility is much more complicated. Relative mobility, just to remind you, it's the idea that whether people who start off as poor end up poor themselves, or whether people who start off as rich end up rich themselves. And it's not in absolute dollars, it's compared to other people in the society. So I'm going to focus initially on just one measure of relative mobility, which is called bottom-up mobility. Bottom-up mobility is going to focus just on poor families. And so here I'll look at just the poorest 20% of families. And the question that we're interested in is, when these children become adults themselves, how much will they earn compared to other people in their generation? So it's not how much will they earn in dollars, it's like, will they be at the top of the distribution? Will they be poor themselves compared to other people who are the same age? In order to study this, you need two main things. You need data on parents' income. So you need, for each kid, you need to know how much their parents made. And then you need to be able to track the kids all the way until they're adults and then measure their income and compare it to other people in their generation. And so the question we're going to be asking is, for children growing up in the poorest 20% of households, where will these poor children end up in terms of their own earnings? And so there's 5 possibilities of places they can end up. They have to end up somewhere, right? So they're either going to be in the poorest 20%, they might be in the richest 20%, they might be somewhere in the middle, right? But because it's a relative measure, everyone's going to be somewhere in the population. And so if we had a perfectly equal society, or not perfectly equal, perfectly mobile society, where you start off doesn't affect at all where you end up, what we would see is that you would have equal numbers of people in each of these groups. And so you would have 20% of people would end up poor themselves. So 20% of the poor kids would end up poor as adults, but 20% of the poor kids would also end up rich as adults. There would be no real relationship between where you start off and where you end up. I think some people's gut is that if there's perfect mobility, then everyone who starts off poor should become rich. But that doesn't really work when we're talking about relative mobility, because if everyone who started off poor ended up rich, then everybody who started off rich would have to end up poor, and then the middle would stay where they are, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so what I mean when I say perfect mobility is just that where you start off has no relationship to where you end up. So whether you're rich or poor growing up, you're going to have sort of an equal chance of landing in any of these categories. Okay, so I think the right benchmark to think of, instead of thinking about comparing it to 0% or 100%, you want to think about each of these relative to 20%. That would be perfect mobility. What we actually see is very far from perfect mobility. We see 42% of the kids who start off poor remain poor. So 42% of people who start off in the bottom 20% end up there as well. It's not necessarily the case that sort of where you start is your destiny, though. There are people who make it out. And so 7% of kids who start off as in the poorest 20% end up in the richest 20%. So they go from growing up very poor to being quite affluent themselves. Is this a lot? I would say that it's difficult to judge. I don't really know. In one sense, it's not a lot of bottom-up mobility because a lot of people are staying poor. So 40% are staying poor, another 20% are staying relatively poor, lower middle class to poor. So something like 2/3 of people who grow up poor are still poor when they grow up themselves. And that's not great. On the other hand, if you look at the top 3 categories here, so the 18% who end up sort of in the middle, the 11% who are upper middle class, the 7% who are rich, that's 36% of all the people. It's more than 1/3. And so the fact that, you can grow up very poor in the US and have a reasonable shot of getting out of poverty, making it to the middle class or above, does say that this is different than like a perfectly aristocratic society where people who are poor stay poor their whole lives, or the next generation stays poor as well. One thing that's helpful is just comparing this to other countries. And so that's what this graph is going to show. So the graph is going to, first we have the US up here. So the axis here is what percent of poor kids stay poor. And so for the United States, I just told you a second ago, it's 42%. And so that number is just one of the measures of mobility. It's asking people who are poor, do they stay poor? I put up here the 20% of perfect mobility just as a reference point. And so if a society was perfectly mobile, we would see 20% of poor kids staying poor. Instead, we see 42% staying poor. And then you've got Finland, UK, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And this is where they all are. So this is the fraction of poor kids who stay poor in each of these societies. This is not a random group of countries, obviously, and it's just a small subset, but it's difficult to make these measures. And so this is what I was able to find. That's a very comparable measure. And so, across the board, all of these countries have considerably lower levels of sort of being stuck in poverty compared to the United States. Denmark, for example, at 25% is getting pretty close to perfect mobility. Okay. A separate question is what percent of poor kids become rich adults? And so that's sort of like how many people escape poverty, not just a little bit, but all the way. They start off at the bottom 20%, they end up at the top 20%. That's this graph. And so you have in the United States, I said a moment ago, 7% of kids are able to make it out of the bottom 20% and make it to the top. If it was perfect mobility, it would be 20%. And then you've got Finland, UK, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and I also added Canada for this one. And so it's, nobody's really quite at perfect mobility. But all of these other countries are quite a bit higher than the US, especially Canada. The economist Raj Chetty has done a lot of research in this area on mobility, and he has a nice quote, I think, referring to the Canadian-US difference in the probability that you're going to go from very poor to very rich. He says, you're twice as likely to realize the American dream if you're growing up in Canada rather than in the US. Okay, so do people perceive these differences correctly? So we saw earlier that people in the US think it's a pretty meritocratic society. But we can do better than that. We can ask people directly, do you think, or sort of what do you think these numbers are going to be? And so there's a survey conducted of 4 different countries. And in each country, they asked people, what fraction of children born in the poorest 20% of households will end up in the top 20%? So it's exactly the question that I just showed you a second ago. And they surveyed the United States, France, Italy, and Sweden. In blue here, I've put the reality, what I showed a minute ago for all these countries. And then in orange is the perception, what people think is true about their country. And so in the United States, it has, compared to these other countries, the lowest level of actual mobility and the highest level of perceived mobility. The US is the only country to dramatically overstate how much mobility there actually is. Okay, so in terms of thinking about how the US compares to other countries, I would say the main takeaway is the US has lower actual levels of mobility than most other countries that are sort of similar, but much higher levels of perceived mobility. So we still believe in the American dream, even if it's not really so realistic anymore. Okay, even though the American dream overall doesn't compare very well to other countries, there's a lot of variation within the country. Not every state is exactly the same. Not every city is exactly the same. And so Raj Chetty, who I mentioned a second ago, and his co-authors calculated bottom-up mobility, this measure that I just described, for every region of the country, more or less every city and commuting zone. The measure that they used is the probability that children from the poorest 20% will end up in the top 20%. And so Scandinavian countries, this measure was something like 11%, 12%, Canada was sort of an outlier at 14%. And that's the fraction of people who sort of start off poor and become rich. This map shows for every single region in the country what the number is, and it also highlights a couple of places. So I know it's kind of dense and hard to read, so I'll just highlight a few things. One is the Southeast is not a good place for poor people to grow up, and if they want to escape and become rich themselves. Huge swaths of the Southeast have very low intergenerational mobility at less than 5%. Atlanta, for example, only 4.5% of people who grow up poor are able to become rich. That's very different than some other countries, or some other cities, sorry. San Jose, Salt Lake City are looking like Scandinavian countries. Nowhere's quite reaching the level of Canada, but you have a lot of variation across the country in terms of who's able to start off poor and become rich. Looking at this map, I think a natural question is, would it be a good idea for somebody who's poor to move from Atlanta to San Jose, right? If you move from Atlanta to San Jose, can you get that sort of escape velocity for your children? Will it help them in the long run? And so there's actually a randomized experiment that was conducted to answer this exact question. And the answer is yes. So the experiment is the Moving to Opportunity experiment done by HUD. It was actually done in Chicago and then also in some other cities. And the results were pretty consistent. What the experiment was is some low income Chicago residents were randomly given these housing vouchers. And what the housing voucher was for is it was a housing voucher that could only be used if you moved to a higher income area. And so it encouraged these people to move from relatively high poverty areas to relatively low poverty areas. And then they were able to track the kids of these families and look at them as adults. So when they're 28, 29, 30. And what they find is that for kids who were under 13 at the time of the move, moving to a higher income area increased their eventual earnings by 30%. So it's a really, really big increase in their earnings from being able to grow up in a different neighborhood. People who were over 13 at the time of the move didn't benefit at all. And so I think that points to just this idea of sort of you have to really grow up in the neighborhood. You can't just move in the neighborhood when you're 18 and claim that you're going to get the benefits from that neighborhood. So moving from one neighborhood to another does help mobility. One problem though with moving from one neighborhood to the other is it's fine for an individual family, but it's not fine for a society to have the plan of like, let's all move to San Jose, right? Because you need some people living in Atlanta still. You can't just move everybody around to solve mobility issues. And so the more direct or the more scalable approach is to think about what is it that's different in San Jose or what's different about Seattle compared to Atlanta that allows kids to make upward mobility, and can we take some of those things and bring them to Atlanta? Can we improve everywhere? And unfortunately, the answer to that is much less clear. So why are some neighborhoods worse for mobility? We don't have much direct evidence on this. There's some best guesses based on things that seem to be correlated with places with a lot of mobility. And so the best guesses are low quality K-12 education is bad for mobility, and residential segregation and concentrated poverty, places where almost everybody is poor, is bad for mobility. There's various theories about why these two things are bad for mobility, but again, it's not really concrete evidence that says that if you increase the level of education, then you will improve the amount of mobility. Okay, so the map I showed a second ago illustrates that the amount of mobility varies a lot by place. So Atlanta is very low mobility, San Jose is very high. It also varies quite a bit within a place by race and sex. So this is, directly speaks to this question of class versus race. Here we're going to look at poor white boys and their upward mobility compared to poor black boys and their upward mobility. And the key thing is that all the boys are starting off in families making the same amount in the bottom 20%. And then we're wondering how they do in the long term. And so for white boys, it's not so bad actually, compared to other countries. 10% end up in the richest 20%, only 30% end up in the poorest 20%. That looks something like, say, the UK. For poor black boys, though, it's quite different. Only 2% end up in the top 20%, and almost half end up in the very, very bottom 20%. And so this suggests that, even if you're holding fixed income and thinking about poor kids compared to other poor kids, race matters, and it matters quite a bit. These differences are really stark. So this is measuring the likelihood that poor people will end up rich or poor people will end up poor themselves. That's one measure of mobility. How do the poor do? A separate measure is called top-down mobility. Top-down mobility describes where children from rich families end up as adults when they become adults. So top-down mobility is basically, if you start off rich, are you ensured that your kids will be rich as well when they grow up? Or is there a lot of top-down mobility where people maybe grow up rich, but then end up not doing so well when they become adults? Okay, here's where I think there's very particularly stark contrasts across race. So top-down mobility, for people who grow up rich, so children who grow up in the richest 20% of households, 40% of their kids end up rich for white boys. For black boys, though, it's only 17%. And that 17% numbers is quite stark, especially because remember the sort of reference point is 20%. 20% would be perfect mobility. They're doing worse than perfect mobility. Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, actually I can go on to this slide. So this is for black boys coming from the richest 20% of families. So black boys who are likely growing up in fairly affluent neighborhoods. Their parents have a lot of resources. Where do they end up? You might think that at this point they've sort of escaped from poverty. Their parents were rich. They grew up in a rich environment. But only 17% of these kids end up rich themselves, and 21% end up in the very bottom, the poorest 20%. That's dramatic. When you look at the other sort of parts of the distribution, it's more or less an even spread. So sort of ironically, the only place in the US where there's really true mobility, almost perfect mobility, is for black boys coming from rich families. Black boys coming from poor families are stuck. White boys coming from rich families, they also are stuck to a great degree, stuck at the top. Black boys from the rich family, there's a lot of mobility. They can fall just in one generation. Okay, I keep on saying boys instead of black children, and that's because there's a big difference between boys and girls when you're talking about race. And this I don't really know, I don't have a good answer for why. But when you look at black men compared to white men who come from a similar background, the black men make much less than the white men. But for black women compared to white women who grew up in similar backgrounds, they make the same amount. And so this is not saying that black women make just as much as white women in general, because black women tend to have parents that are poor. It's saying that if you have a black woman and a white woman whose parents are making the same amount, they end up doing just as well as one another. Whereas that is not the case for black boys and compared to white boys. Okay. So bottom up and top down mobility are just parts of the story. There's all sorts of things that you can describe when you're talking about mobility. So for example, what fraction of the rich kids become middle class? What fraction of poor kids become middle class? What happens to the middle class? Where do they go? All of these things are complicated, and you can summarize them using a very complicated term, intergenerational earnings elasticity. This is what economists use to summarize overall for a whole society, how much mobility is there? How much are people moving up and down the ladder? And so using this measure, we can compare the US to a bunch of different countries. And this measure is available for a wide range of countries. And so this is just a sampling of countries that are more mobile than the US and countries that are less mobile. So the more mobile countries are France, Spain, Japan, Germany, Sweden, Australia, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Canada, and many others. This is just a sampling. And then less mobile countries are countries like China, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Slovenia. In general, a lot of Latin America tends to be less mobile. And broadly, countries with more inequality tend to be less mobile. Part of the reason I think that the US has lower mobility is because it is a more unequal society, which I'll talk about in detail a little bit later. Okay, so is the US exceptional in terms of the amount of mobility that we have? Is it a land of opportunity for poor people? I would say definitely not, not by any stretch. So was Marx wrong? No, he wasn't. The US was a place of unusual opportunity back when he was writing. So in 1830, US mobility was, it's harder to estimate in 1830 because there's not really good data, but the best estimate suggests that US was about as mobile as Denmark is today. How do we estimate mobility in the 1850s? We don't have really detailed information about what every single person made or what the parents made. The kind of data that we have available today wasn't available back then. And so instead, they use a more limited measure. And so the mobility measure for 1850 is, did sons of unskilled fathers obtain skilled jobs? So basically, they just know what the occupation was. So it's occupational mobility. And so in Britain and in the United States, they can measure this. So in Britain, 50% of sons that had unskilled fathers, fathers with no education essentially, ended up obtaining skilled jobs themselves in the 1850s. In the United States, that number was quite a bit higher. 80% of those with unskilled fathers obtained skilled jobs. And so that reflects the fact that I don't know of data available for a lot of other countries, but at least the UK versus the US was much more mobile in the 19th century compared to the UK. That is certainly no longer the case. So when did the American dream die, if it did die? So in terms of relative mobility, it was different than absolute mobility. So in terms of the probability that poor people stay poor, or the probability that rich people stay rich, that's the relative mobility. The mobility rate really had fallen quite a bit by the early 20th century. So for the past 100 years, the level of mobility that we see today is more or less the same as it was 100 years ago. So the US was no longer a leader in terms of mobility starting about 100 years ago. And so American mobility today is lower than most similar countries, and it has been for quite a while. In terms of absolute mobility, so like the probability that you actually are going to make more than your parents, that's the graph I showed at the beginning. The vast majority of baby boomers earn more than their parents. They had a lot of absolute mobility. Even though the sort of relative ranking stayed pretty similar, most people were doing better. And that was just because the whole country was experiencing growth that was widespread. For millennials, it's a coin flip. And so a coin flip is, I think, very far from where we want to be. Okay, so relative mobility, this idea of how easy is it to go from the bottom to the top, has been similar for a long, long time in the US, but that doesn't mean the consequences of that mobility is the same. And so the reason for this is that inequality has gotten a lot worse in the US. And immobility is worse, or the consequences of immobility is worse when the gap between the rich and the poor is large. And so as an example, if you're poor in the US versus poor in Denmark, if you stay poor in Denmark, maybe it's not ideal, but it's not quite as bad as staying poor in the US because the poor in Denmark are doing much better compared to the rich relative to the US. So in the US, where there's a lot of inequality, you really don't want to be stuck at the bottom. And so the fact that people are stuck at the bottom matters more and more and more as inequality gets worse and worse. And so the rest of the talk is going to be about those changes in inequality, describing how has inequality changed, and also why has it changed in the ways it has. Okay, so excuse me. There's a lot of different ways to measure inequality. I'm going to focus on just one measure, which is, I would say, incomplete, which is what share of the total income in a society is going to the top 1%. So when you think of the richest top 1%, how much income do they get compared to everybody else? And so in a very equal society, if everyone makes almost the exact same amount, if you look at the richest 1%, they would only get about 1% of the income, maybe a little bit more. In a society that's incredibly unequal, if all the money went to the top 1%, they would get 100% of the income. And so we want to know what share of total income goes to the top 1%. The reason this is an incomplete measure of inequality is it only tells you how the 1% compares to everybody else. You could have inequality between the poorest and the poor, or the poorest and the middle class, or the middle class and the top. This is just how does the top compare to everybody else. Okay, so this is a very long run picture of this question. So it's showing us the percent of income that's going to the top 1% over about 100 years, going from 1913 to present. A lot of people, or at least I've seen news headlines that talk about how inequality today is the worst it's ever been. In a sense, that's true. If you look at this graph, so this is the share of income going to the top 1%. And today it's quite high at about 20% of all income goes to just 1% of the people. But it's not quite true that it's never been this bad before. So if you go back 100 years, inequality was also quite high. It dropped quite a bit starting in the 1930s and 40s, and the 50s and 60s and 70s were sort of a golden age for inequality, relatively low inequality that's similar to where Denmark is today. And then it rose starting in the 70s and 80s, and it's just been kind of continuously rising since then. You'll notice in this graph there are some very sharp drops. Probably the most dramatic one is the 1929 major drop. In 2008, you also see a major drop. All of these correspond to stock market crashes, which tend to hurt the 1% very much and don't hurt the rest of the population all that much. And so the level of inequality goes down usually when there's a crash. Okay, so I don't have much to say about why inequality fell so much in the first part of the 20th century. I'm going to mainly talk about why has it been rising so much in the past 40 years. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about every single one of these. If people have questions about some of them, I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But these are just some potential explanations that I've heard posited. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means. And so some reasons why inequality has gone up maybe is lower taxes on the rich. Unions have declined, and unions tend to bolster the middle class. There's been a decrease in the minimum wage. In real terms, the minimum wage doesn't get the same purchasing power as it did, say, in the 60s. You also have globalization and technological changes, which have hurt poor people relative to richer people. And then also rising immigration is a potential explanation. This is because immigrants tend to be one of two types. There's oftentimes poor immigrants who are coming to the US, and then there's also relatively affluent immigrants. There's not a lot in the middle. And so when you have more immigration, you could have more inequality just because you have these people coming in from two different ends of the spectrum. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all of these. Again, I did want to mention one of these, which is the taxation rate. So the reason people think taxes could be an explanation is that in 1986, and then a few other times, there have been major reductions in the tax rate paid by the very wealthy. And so the wealthy today pay a lower tax rate than they did 40, 50 years ago. And so potentially that could explain why they have so much more money. That's a very easy explanation to check, though, because we can look not just how much money do they have after taxes, but we can look at how much money do they actually earn, like their pre-tax earnings. Did inequality go up with that? And if it did, then it means that taxes probably aren't the thing that's causing the underlying increase. And so this graph shows the same graph I showed a second ago. The difference is that it shows both the pre-tax income levels and the post-tax income levels. And so in the blue, we have the income share going to the top 1% before you think about any taxes at all. Just how much do they actually made? Because the system is progressive, the inequality is lower if you include taxes. But I think the main takeaway here is that the overall pattern of decreasing inequality followed by increasing inequality That's true whether you include taxes or you don't include taxes. So it's not saying that taxes don't have any part in this, but it doesn't seem like it's a big part of the story. Another way to sort of indirectly get at a lot of these explanations is to compare the US experience to other countries' experience. So for the minimum wage, for example, the US has a specific minimum wage, but that minimum wage doesn't apply to other countries. And so if it's the case that it's a specific US policy like the minimum wage, then we might see the increase in inequality just in the US and not in all these other countries. If we see it sort of everywhere, then it suggests it's something broader, maybe not the minimum wage. The minimum wage, by the way, is a very bad explanation for what I showed a second ago, because the minimum wage has almost no effect on people at the very, very top. It's unlikely to be able to explain a big part of inequality because of that. So this graph shows income shares of the top 1%. So what fraction of income goes to the top 1% for 7 different countries. The United States is in blue. And you do see that the big increase in the United States is somewhat exceptional compared to these other countries. It's much higher. It's much, much higher than, say, a country like France or Japan. But even countries that saw similar increases don't have the same magnitude. Though the US is exceptional in terms of the magnitude, it's not exceptional in the fact that there was this increase in inequality. That happened in a lot of places. This is just 7 countries, but if you look at say all of the OECD countries or all of the relatively developed countries, almost every country saw an increase. Even France and Japan here, that are relatively low levels of inequality, do see increases over this time period. So it does seem like it's a global phenomenon. One interesting thing that I really don't know what to make of is that if you look at the countries that have the highest inequality growth here, it's the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and then I don't have it on here, but Australia would also be one. All English-speaking countries for some reason. Germany also has a decent amount of inequality growth during this time period, but there's research ongoing that's trying to understand, what is it about speaking English that has led to more inequality over the last 40 years? It might just be coincidence, but it is pretty systematic. Okay. So the one explanation that I think most economists believe is a pretty important part is this idea of technological change. There's a lot of different components to technological change. The reason that it has the potential and likely did increase inequality quite a bit is because high-skilled workers tend to benefit a lot from technological changes, and low-skilled workers either don't benefit or suffer. And so an example would be robots displacing low-skilled workers. So the robots make it harder for low-skilled workers, and at the same time, they create high-skilled jobs working with the robots, programming the robots, robot technicians, things along those lines. That's a potential reason why you could get inequality just from technological progress. The computer is an example where computers make a lot of people much, much more productive, but only people who are relatively skilled get to use computers and get that productivity benefit. If you think about a janitor working today versus 40 years ago, that person's doing more or less the same job. If you think about an engineer working today versus 40 years ago, it's a totally different story. Okay. So overall takeaways from this talk. So the first big one is that America did have high levels of economic mobility in the 19th century, but no longer. Compared to other countries in the world, mobility is lower than most peer countries. It's harder to move up if you're starting at the bottom. Inequality is worse than most peer countries. So the gap between the rich and poor is higher. I would say if there's any truth to American exceptionalism today, it's this idea of undue optimism about mobility. So the US seems to be the one country where everyone believes that there's a lot of mobility in the face of facts pointing otherwise. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Ben, for a very interesting talk. I'm going to go ahead and close this. As I mentioned at the outset, we're going to have a brief interlude, and after that, I will read questions that you submit over the YouTube channel, which is why I'm going to have my phone out, even though that's rude. During the interlude, we also encourage people to make a donation. We love $5 just because there you are, but anything more or less is also welcome. And the interlude slides will show how to donate. And I'll be back to ask your questions afterwards. Thank you. So thanks for your donations, and you can always give online at any time at our website. I'm going to start reading questions that are coming in through the YouTube channel, but you can still enter some. And there's a couple people here in the room, and if they have questions, they can raise their hand and come on up and ask them as well. So Ben, I'm going to ask the question, and I'm going to move aside, and Ben, I'll stand here to answer it. So the first question: people today have many more material advantages, such as smartphones, etc., than in 1945. Do you include this fact in your studies?
Great, thanks so much. The easy answer to this is no. That's not really accounted for at all. There are inflation adjustments, but that's not going to account for like the quality of the stuff that we have today. And so I would say the things like smartphones is something that's happening everywhere in all countries. And so it can't explain, it's not like the US has a monopoly on smartphones and so people in the US are doing better than other countries, but no, it's true. It might be that people might be objectively better off because they have access to better technology, even if they don't have as much income.
Next question. I'm curious about mobility statistics for immigrants to the US.
That's a good question, something I don't know a lot about. So in terms of how immigrants in the US fare compared to natives, I do know that there's a lot more mobility for immigrants. So immigrants do tend to be fairly successful. That said, I don't know how that compares to other countries in terms of the income mobility for immigrants in, say, the UK compared to in the US. I just don't know. I do think that there's historically been, in all countries, more economic success among immigrants than Mexican immigrants have had in the US over the last 40 or 50 years. they do seem to lag a bit compared to sort of the typical immigrant story.
What is the income cutoff for top 1%, and is that figure skewed by exceptionally wealthy handful?
All right, thanks for the question. So the top 1% is a concept that changes over time. So in the graphs that I showed before, you have going all the way back to 1915 to today, showing the share of income going to the top 1%. But the threshold that you need to be in the top 1% is very different in all those years. And so that's why that's a relative measure. It's like just that you're making more than 99% of the other people. It's not a specific threshold. Today, I don't know the number, but it's something like $500,000 of annual income would get you into the top 1% in that ballpark. So in terms of being skewed by a handful of very wealthy people, say like Jeff Bezos skews that number a lot, that's not going to skew it actually at all. It's the reason is that the top 1% number is not the average of what people make in the top 1%. It's what does the lowest 1%er earn, essentially. And so when you think about, what's the lowest amount of money you can make in order to make yourself a top 1%er, that's going to be about $500,000. And whether Jeff Bezos makes $1 billion or $100 billion, that's going to be the exact same number. It'll still be about $500,000.
I have a bunch more questions, but I think we're going to have time for more. So if you have them, feel free to enter them. The next one I have here, I have a sense that accounting for transfers leads to somewhat different conclusions about how badly the bottom households have fared. Do you agree with that?
So in terms of, I don't know if the question's about absolute or relative mobility. It's certainly the case that when you incorporate taxes and transfers, so like welfare payments, the level of inequality doesn't look quite as bad because poor people tend to get more benefits and pay less taxes than richer people. In terms of changes over time, I do not have the sense that it's going to change any of the qualitative stories. So there is a little bit of income growth in the bottom, but it's not dramatic. There's also, or it's not nearly as dramatic as the income growth at the top. In terms of mobility patterns, I don't think it would change qualitatively anything that I said. Okay.
Has anyone studied whether quote unquote winner take all effect, parentheses, AKA the economics of superstars, end parentheses, is more powerful for English language speakers? Seems plausible, question mark?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. So the idea of winners take all, for those of you who aren't familiar with that idea, is I think one way of thinking about it is 200 years ago, you would have, say, a local band in each city, and that local band would draw a local audience and make a decent amount of money at the local bar, say. Today, you can have one mega global superstar who's blasted into the televisions of every bar in the world, and all the money goes to her. And all the local bands have no real ability to compete because they're so much worse than she is. And so that's the idea of a winner-take-all society. Whether it's different in US-speaking or English-speaking countries, I have no idea. It's an interesting theory. I suppose it would make sense in the sense that they can have access to a more global audience, but I don't know if that is likely to empirically explain the differences, since the real superstars that are like global superstars are probably in this like Jeff Bezos category, not so much affecting like who's making $500,000.
And now one of our live audience members is going to ask you a question.
So it's obvious to me that rich people are controlling our political narrative. And does that happen in the same way in other democratic countries?
Do you have another question?
Okay. The next question I have is, how does the quality of life for the lower 20% in the United States vary from the quality of life of the lower 20% in, say, Denmark or?
Great questions, thanks. So for the first one, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't want to speculate, so I really don't have any idea how sort of influence of money in the US compares to influence of money in some of these other countries. For the second question, how does sort of the absolute quality of life for somebody in the bottom 20% in the US compare to, say, Denmark? I think for that comparison, it's pretty easy. It's better to live in Denmark. That's because the US is not that much richer than Denmark, and the US inequality is much, much worse. That said, it doesn't have to be like that for every country. So even though the US is quite unequal, it's possible that you're still better off living in the US as a poor person than you are maybe living in a much poorer country like Colombia as a relatively poor person, even if inequality was different. I think the absolute level of sort of economic sort of sustenance that people have in the US at the very bottom of the distribution is obviously quite a bit higher than it is in a lot of countries still. Even poor people in the US are still doing better than large swaths of, say, like India or other poor countries.
Another YouTube question, can you discuss ways to address our income inequality?
Yes, great question. So I think some of the most prominent ways of addressing income inequality have to do with skills. So the example I gave with computers, where computers potentially help exacerbate inequality because people who use them or know how to use them are able to get the benefits from the technology, and people who don't can't. How do you address that? Well, one way that I think would be a bad way is like outlaw computers, try to get rid of the technology. That's not going to work very well. I think a more practical way is try to make sure that everybody has the skills necessary to take advantage of the technology. I study education policy a lot, so I have a lot of different sort of ideas of how to improve education broadly, but I think both K-12 and higher education both have the potential to reduce income inequality. I didn't show it here, but there's a lot of evidence that mobility is very directly enabled by education. So education allows for mobility. There's a bunch of other ideas that people have put out. I think I'll leave it there though, because there's so many that I don't think I can do any one of them justice.
I'm going to combine a couple that are sort of related. The one is income inequality between countries also increasing, and should we expect income inequality, I think both within the US and internationally, to grow in the near future?
So the future, who knows? When I was putting together these slides, I saw a lot of projections in various papers, and the projections were all made in 2018, and they were projecting out to 2022. And I would be shocked if any of them was remotely accurate, given that some things have happened between 2018 and today. In terms of inequality between countries, my expectation is that that's actually going to go down in the future, not up. And the reason is, especially if you look 50 years ago, you had huge portions of the world's population in extreme poverty. Like China is a big example, where almost everybody in China was extremely poor. Not that long ago, 50 years ago. Today, very, very few people in China are really at like the very, very bottom of the global income distribution. And so income inequality as a global phenomenon, I think, has gone down over time as very, very poor countries with huge populations become richer, China and India being the main ones. I'm optimistic that trend will continue, and that the poorest countries in the world will hopefully continue to develop and become richer and catch up with the rest of the world. And I don't think it's likely that the US would get dramatically richer. I think it's most likely that China's going to catch up, India's going to catch up, at least to some extent. And that's going to lower overall inequality.
Again, two that I'm going to kind of join together. So stick with me while I do that. One is I have the sense that the biggest bang for the buck in terms of helping people comes at very early ages. And I'm personally thinking about the Heckman kind of work. Are there any scalable programs that we know work well for helping poor people at early ages? And then the subsequent comment was, please do talk about education reform. So maybe those go together.
Great. So I think there's conflicting evidence actually on this point about whether the earliest investments make the biggest difference. There is certainly studies that have argued that. The work that Katie was referring to by Heckman and others is looking at programs like the Perry Preschool Project and a few others where there's very intensive interventions that happen during the preschool years, where it's high quality preschool combined with home visits, combined with a few other interventions that are on like the health side of things, not just education. And those have been shown to really transform kids' lives and have long-term effects, and not only on their kids' lives, but their kids' kids. So the kids of the preschoolers, when they eventually have kids themselves, end up doing better in school and better on a number of measures. That said, I think there's also evidence that it's not like high school is too late. So there's a number of studies that show that it's possible to transform high schools into really, really high achieving high schools from low achieving high schools, and fundamentally change the trajectory of kids, even if they're at 14 and it looks like they're sort of destined to low achievement. It's possible to turn that around even at an older age. What is less successful is turning it around for adults. So there's not very much today, but for decades, there was a lot of interest in worker training programs. And that, I think I mentioned a little while ago, is like an ideal thing to do, to try to train workers who have low skills to bring them up to date. That has less success on the whole. You can mainly reduce inequality. I think it's harder to get a 50-year-old and teach them how to use a high-tech device that they've never used before and don't have the skills to use. It's easier to sort of invest in K-12 college level education and try to transform it for the future. So that's a little bit of a pessimistic note, because it means it's a little hard to help people right now, at least in terms of skills. One thing you can do is you can have a more generous transfer program, just like more generous welfare benefits, more generous unemployment insurance, that would help people even if they don't have those skills. In terms of education policy, I think there's a wide range. Last year I gave a talk about college accessibility. College, I think, is certainly a pathway, not just like academic college, but all types of college. So vocational programs in colleges. Germany has like a very extensive like apprenticeship program, can also be effective. The graphs I didn't show here show that education is key to access, or key to intergenerational mobility, but a big problem is that there's huge differences in who gets access to that education. So if you look at Ivy League schools today, I think the number is something like ballpark of 15% or 20% are coming from very affluent backgrounds, and only something like 3% are coming from the bottom 20%. And so there's huge differences in terms of who's able to access that. Making college free is a proposal that a lot of people have put out. That I think actually isn't necessarily the right idea. Rather than that, just making college accessible more broadly. So giving, the reason college being free doesn't make a lot of sense to me is because currently there's a lot of people who are quite wealthy going to, say, Harvard, and who can afford to go to Harvard without much difficulty. I'm not sure why you need to make college free for those individuals. Instead, I think what Harvard's doing right now makes a lot of sense, where it's free for people who don't have the means to go there. So I think if you're making something like $80,000 or below, going to Harvard's pretty much free. If your parents make $1 million, it's not free, and it's extraordinarily expensive, but those people can afford it. At the K-12 level, I think there's a lot of different policies that have been demonstrated to be effective, but I think the big takeaway that I have is that you have to focus on getting high quality teachers. Most interventions that don't focus on teachers aren't going to be particularly effective. It really matters who's in the classroom in front of the kids. All right.
So I think this may be a little bit of a left turn, but I'm going to try. You ready?
Yes.
Just based on my own, my nieces and nephews who are roughly your kind of age, and my own perception of their friends and whatever, at some point, are we missing something important about what's going on in the world by focusing on income, when I feel like the young adults in my life are working very hard at perceiving success in a different way, and that they are well educated, they come from relatively wealthy households, and aren't necessarily maximizing income, but in fact really investing in community engagement and other kinds of things in a way that they're gonna drop out of a quartile down to another, or quintile to another one, and they're fine. And I'm wondering if there's a better measure at some point over time, and if this reinforces the focus on money as the measure of well-being.
Great. I totally agree with the sentiment of that question. I have seen, there's more happiness sort of surveys. Are you satisfied with your occupation kind of questions? I haven't seen like wide scale studies done of mobility on those sorts of dimensions. I guess there's two things. One, I totally agree that if somebody grows up affluent and ends up choosing an occupation that's not particularly high paying, but is very satisfying in other ways, or is just doing other things in their life that means they don't have a high income, but they're satisfied, that's great. That's a big success. I don't think we want to say that, I find it doubtful that kids from poor families are all pursuing their passion and kids from rich families are all miserable working at these like terrible jobs that it makes them a lot of money. That's probably not what's going on. So if you survey people about how important is having a high income to you, you will find that people who grew up in poor families report that as being exceptionally important. It's something they really want. And so if it's something they really want, it seems like a reasonable thing to measure. My guess, this has no like hard evidence to back it up, just anecdotes speaking with students at UIC where I teach, where a lot of students are first generation college students. I get the sense that this idea of your occupation being something that's going to be not necessarily highly paid, but very satisfying emotionally is something that tends to be more on the minds of people who grew up in affluent households and maybe have more of a safety net. People who grew up in poor households, end up in college, oftentimes are very focused on getting an occupation that's going to be able to provide them a level of security, financial security.
Well, I want to thank you very much for a great talk, and we're going to clap again. Yay. It's lovely to be not alone. Yay. And some first class clappers up there. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn to the announcements, but before I do, I just want to say, even though it doesn't seem like that big a deal for us to be broadcasting these this way, it takes a lot of smart people working really hard, and I'm really grateful for all the great ideas and the time and energy. So yay. I'm going to close. I started thinking about what this talk was going to be about today, and somehow my mind went to John Rawls, a current or modern philosopher, largely at Harvard, I believe. I don't know if you guys all took the same class I did at college, but he spoke a lot about issues of justice and how they relate to economic inequality and things. And I just want to leave with a quote from John Rawls. "The fairest rules are those to which everyone would agree if they did not know how much power they would have." Thanks. Yeah.